History? History? We don't have no stinking history. Oh, wait. Yeah, we do.
Hi, my name is Alison Tieman, and I'm the founder of HoneyBadgerRadio. My early introduction to men's issues came from my mother, who gave me the book The Princess at the Window. From there, I started studying men's issues at my local university library and ended up applying and being accepted into an undergraduate program in science there. I continued to pursue my studies into men's issues for several years, and eventually, through my university computer access, I began to explore the online world of men's issues in soc.men, a Usenet news group devoted to discussing issues affecting men. At the time, starting with soc.men, I was a fence-sitter, one of those people who smugly said things like men's rights activists are exactly the same as feminists. But as I interacted on soc.men, my attitude started to change, and I was eventually invited to Stand Your Ground, a web forum created by one of the early online men's rights pioneers. My thinking when I was part of Stand Your Ground was still very binary. I no longer equated men's rights activists in the West with feminists, but I thought that the West was misandrous in the same way that Muslims were misogynist. At Stand Your Ground, I described how some Muslim men would refuse to touch women for fear that they were menstruating, thus dirty, and how that paralleled my father's experience with lesbian separatists at my mother's feminist rallies, when he volunteered to bartend, and how those lesbian separatists refused to touch any drinks my father had poured for them. I still had that two poles with myself in the middle thinking, except now I was between the men-hating West and the woman-hating Middle East. At the same time, I was beginning to be concerned about how angry and hateful I was becoming, mostly at Western women, but also at Muslim men. A few years later, I stumbled over a blog, Feminist Critics, created by several liberal men's issues enthusiasts, one of whom identifies as a feminist. Feminist Critics was a turning point in my thinking. One of the bloggers, his screen name is Ballgame, it's still there as far as I know, studied violence in the Middle East extensively and found that the more control an aggressor had over the victims of his violence, the less likely he was to choose to direct it at women. Even in the Middle East, just like the West, criminals and terrorists prefer to do violence to men over women. That, and happening on a strange quote I don't remember the source of, a quote that said, "The men and women of every era and every country deserve each other," set me on a different path, away from my radical centrism. I started to think less in terms of sides, men versus women, West versus East, and more in terms of gender dynamics and how they function together to create society, how men and women function together to create society. I started a blog called Genderaddict, and I explored the situation for men and how the situation for men is tied to the situation for women, and vice versa. I started to suspect using words like oppression when it comes to sex roles was a way of hiding the truth, which is far more complex and points to the interdependence of both men and women psychologically as well as physically. About the time I started up Genderaddict, I also started posting on Reddit's men's rights board. In 2012, the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, declared the men's rights movement a hate movement. It then walked its declaration back in 2012, but has since reinstated it in 2018. In the beginning of 2012, I didn't identify as a men's rights activist or a feminist or anything really. But when the SPLC made its decision to start targeting the men's rights movement, some men in men's rights Reddit, who had only ever had support for their issues from the men's rights movement, took it very hard. There was a rash of men talking about suicide. And I remember that day very clearly when I started to see the comments appear contemplating suicide because they were part of something that was being profoundly ostracized. they had taken strength from something that was being thrown out and being made into something that was beyond the pale, something evil. And I remember those comments, and I remember being so desperate to do something, anything. And the only thing I could think to do was to start to identify as a men's rights activist, so that if the SPLC chose to throw them away and ostracize them and stigmatize them and call them evil and not worthy of being considered human, then it would be doing the same to me as well. There was one user whose account was never heard from again. We still don't know if he committed suicide. It was discovered after some digging that a suicide had occurred at his location on the same date, but we never knew if it was him. That's when I chose to call myself a men's rights activist. Not because I believed or agreed with any orthodoxy, which I don't think there really is one, but because if the SPLC chose to cast those men, my fellow travelers, into the dark, then I decided it could do the same to me as well. And that's how I came to the men's rights side. From a smug centrist declaring that men's rights activists and feminists are the same, eventually I came to realize that they weren't. No matter what feminists do, they can do no wrong. And no matter what feminists do right, they can do no right. And as long as people can't advocate for men's rights as freely as they do women's, I'll call myself a men's rights activist.
I found the men's movement entirely by accident. Back in 2008, I was writing erotica for women, and part of managing my career and keeping up with publisher and industry news had me participating on several romance and erotica writers' boards and review websites. These sites were infested with feminists of the newly emerging intersectional variety. I recall leaving a comment on one popular site on a post that was heavily pro-feminism to remark that I was not a feminist. Some 350 furious, excoriating replies later, I gave up trying to defend my position as an equalist and just let them keep screaming at me until they finally got bored and stopped. So there I was, on the same site, if I recall, and someone made a post linking to a men's website with the suggestion that all of us empowered women ought to go over there and take these sexist, chauvinist, misogynist, whiny man-babies down a peg or two. Out of curiosity, I clicked over and read the article, which, frankly, did come across as complaining and over-trivial. The feminization of science fiction. The basic grievance was as follows. Men like hard sci-fi. You can't find hard sci-fi anymore, whether in books, TV, or movies, because there always has to be a romantic subplot or something in there to make it appeal to women. Why, oh why, can't women just leave men's stuff alone? Generalizations as to what men like and women like aside, I scrolled down to the comments section, where I saw the most interesting thing. The feminists from the review site, those denouncers of sexism and sexual shaming and sexual stereotyping and all things similar, and who in so many of their own comments decried toxic masculinity, the boys don't cry mentality, the alpha-hole romance hero, and the lack of appreciation for vulnerability in men when it came to the cardboard cutout characters in popular romance fiction, they were all there calling the author a whiny man-baby who needed to man up, shut up, and stop complaining. The very feminist readers and writers I knew who objected to the traditional gender roles, who promoted body positivity within the genre, who vociferously condemned virgin shaming and slut-shaming and cramming people into gendered boxes, there they were, all over the comments, calling the male commenters there fat, ugly, neck-bearded losers who couldn't get laid, not real men, and virgins who were just bitter because no woman would touch their tiny little micro-penises. Now this hardly surprised me. It wasn't news to me that feminists are frequently hypocrites on an epic scale, that they preach one thing and practice another. What did surprise me was that the guys in the comments were having none of it. There were no yes dears that day. They didn't try to explain themselves either. They simply called out every sexist shaming comment for exactly what it was, and continued to discuss amongst themselves the conundrum of feminized science fiction. I was intrigued. Long after the feminists had mostly exhausted themselves against the brick wall of these male commenters, I stayed reading the discussion. Eventually, one commenter mentioned that the new Star Trek was pretty good. He'd ripped it off the internet and watched it 10 times. I jumped in and asked him, "Well, who the hell is going to pay $300 million to make a movie for you, you idiot? Why would anyone make movies that only appeal to the people least likely to pay for them? At least your girlfriend would drag you to the theater on date night or buy the director's cut DVD if there's something in the movie for her, but they're not going to spend huge sums of money making shit for people who are just going to steal it." Now, despite my admittedly harsh tone and the fact that I made no secret of the fact that I was female, my comment was taken seriously, and the consensus was that I had a point. Thus began my experience of a truly masculine conversation space, one where women were welcome right up until they demanded special treatment because vagina, at which point they were shown the door. I loved every minute of it. I stayed for months on that website listening to the things men don't say to women, especially not the women in their lives, learning their perspectives, their struggles, their virtues, and their flaws, and also learning about the challenges and disadvantages they face in family court, in criminal court, at work, at home, and with women. I learned a lot about myself there, and a lot about the part I played in the breakdown of my own marriage. I also learned about the many significant forms of institutional discrimination against men and boys, and once I'd seen that, well, there just was no way I could go along with my life and not say something. So I did say something. A lot of things, actually. And here I am.
I was an anti-feminist as soon as I knew what feminism was. You could probably have called me an anti-feminist before then because I was a mouthy little brat and a somewhat obsessive busybody with what some would have called an overdeveloped sense of fairness. I wouldn't have told you I was an anti-feminist at the time or had any inkling that my attitude had a label. I wouldn't have cared if I'd found out it did either. It was going to be my attitude regardless. That said, I never really had to confront the possibility of getting taken in by feminist rhetoric. I was fortunate enough to learn feminism's nature and have plenty of time to recognize the nature of the men and boys around me before encountering much in the way of the ideology at all. So I was kind of immune to it. What I wasn't immune to was a growing awareness of at least the social side and eventually the legal aspects of what I now know to be gynocentric culture. What I guess most people would think of if I said chivalry. Or traditionalism. The cooperative expectations placed on the two sexes. There are two different sets of messages I received about my end of that bargain. Those from my family, which involved reciprocating considerations with compassion, gratitude, caregiving, and mindfulness, versus those of society, which increasingly seemed to mandate resenting the consideration I received as a girl and any reciprocation that might be expected of me. Being the argumentative busybody that I am, the double standards to which I was witness became fodder for arguments, and years later when I had consistent internet access, for online debate. I posted in political message boards railing against panic narratives being used to push the Violence Against Women Act, an unnecessary gendering of existing domestic violence law. I ranted about the double standard it represented, and was immediately branded a man by offended feminists. That was apparently supposed to pass for a counter-argument. Then what I'd been afraid of started hitting people I knew. Two of my friends, at 2 different times in 2 different counties, with 2 totally different circumstances, were convicted of assault for defending themselves against female assailants. One had his conviction overturned on appeal. The other was too demoralized by his treatment in the courtroom to even try. That was when I started writing to my state legislators about due process issues. But because I mistook the problem with VAWA for it just being gendered, I didn't get far. Later, I married a divorcee, and his ex-wife began engaging in custody interference. As this was happening to us, another friend of ours went through his own ordeal as the state continued to garnish his wages for child support and send it to his ex-wife for several months after he obtained custody of his children. To try to find out what we could do about these problems, I began researching information on custody and father's rights online. Our friend's solution came automatically when the Child Support Enforcement Agency finally caught up to the reality of his custody situation. However, he had no recourse to get that 6 months support back. At the same time, there wasn't a lot of readily available information that would help us with our situation beyond hammering home the importance of legal representation. We figured out that when the ex took the kids and fled to the far end of the state, we were going to have to move or my husband would lose contact with his kids. That research did lead me to an awareness that online men's issues discussion was a thing. It wasn't a discussion I contributed to aside from adding to the plethora of stepmoms expressing their outrage over ex-wives' cruel use of their kids as weapons. But I knew men were aware of and discussing more than just custody and child support issues. I got involved with a case that led me to the men's rights movement, in part because moving put us right where that case was happening, and in part because the victim had married one of my best friends. Even after everything I'd seen, if anyone else had started telling me about her husband's crazy ex-wife's behavior, I'd have thought they were engaging in hyperbole. It started with the usual petty woman scorn stuff, but quickly escalated into what would become a 7-year ordeal of malicious prosecution and vexatious litigation. The false allegations ranged from as serious as rape to as frivolous as a restraining order violation via drive-by greeting in a public place. And yes, that was a real accusation she made. In the midst of this, one of my childhood friends, again in a different county, began experiencing a very similar ordeal. I was unable to be there for him directly because of distance, but continually shared information I was learning from my other friend's case in the hopes that that would help him. I also began researching more into the law, discovering just how messed up the Violence Against Women Act really is, and writing about the case as a way of sharing information about the way due process rights had been impacted by this law. To help make sure that the writing was seen so that more people would know, I learned about social bookmarking, and that's how I found Reddit's men's rights subreddit. I continued to share my first writing about the case until the vexatious litigant herself found my writing and threatened to sue the site that had published it. The resulting brouhaha led me to reconsider how I was approaching covering the case, and I switched from a narrative about the experience itself to advice on how to handle the behavior involved. That got the personal blog I started in order to publish that advice pinned to the sidebar of the men's rights subreddit. Reddit is where I got labeled an MRA, not because I was going to court with a falsely accused man, but because I posted in that subreddit. I saw the term being used by Reddit feminists as a slur against men who were there to discuss valid human rights issues. I hadn't made it a point to draw attention to my sex, so whenever I encountered a disapproving feminist in the sub, there was no salesmanship, only condemnation and shaming. Then I found out I was on a list being widely used by regulars in the feminist subreddits to identify users of the men's rights subreddit whenever we posted on the site, so they could be sure to determine their view of anything we posted through the filter of their hatred for MRAs. That's when I accepted the label. I thought, screw you guys. If you're going to use it as a condemnation for things I know are right, then you can condemn me right along with the rest. Reddit is where I first encountered Alison and Karen, also. I kept running across their posts on the site, then their videos, and their blogs. It had been awesome to find a site to discuss these issues in the first place, and it was awesome all over again to find other women there who got it.